One of the things that if you look back at the 20th century, it was certainly the first half of the century or the first 2/3 of the century was about states that were too powerful. Now what we're looking at is non-state actors. This is just nothing we've seen. It may be that some of this was a result of two world wars and the way we set borders in unnatural places. But in the end, we now have to tackle with state actors and non-state actors. And it's not just about basic terrorism. It's about control of nuclear weapons. And it's about the next great threat, which is cyber terrorism. About half of what we see in cyber terrorism is state-sponsored, but there's a lot that isn't. So these are things that we've really got to figure out how our diplomatic and international relations are going to work. We look at institutions like the United Nations that are not equipped to deal with these non-state actors. They're simply not equipped to do so, and that is where so many of our issues are coming from in this new century. So this takes a complete rethinking of the global model, which is hard to do because we're all rethinking our national models too. One of the things that we've got to think about is operating with sophistication when it comes to trade relationships and economic relationships. Trade relationships have secured military relationships. They've secured borders for years. You generally get into fewer arguments with people with whom you trade on an ongoing basis. So when we're talking about an American reset, a pivot toward Asia, but less attention to China, it's all based on the idea that the relationship with China is very, very fruitful for both parties. China's not looking to lose its American audience. China needs America, and America needs China. America is just trying to sort of say, hey, let's just adjust the balance of power. It's a very Cold War way of thinking about it, but let's help the other countries in Asia that are weaker and are not going to grow into little Chinas strengthen their positions a bit. The Philippines, Vietnam, places like that. So this is not to be read as anti-China as much as it's about the fact that perhaps we've got too many apples in the Chinese basket and we need to spread it around a little bit more. One of the weaknesses of political discussions and campaigns in the West over the last few years is how a candidate comes in, identifies this problem of income and wealth inequality, and blames the incumbent, when in fact it's happening everywhere around the world. Wealth inequality has simply been growing, and it has become a mainstay of international discussions at the World Bank, at the IMF, at Davos. People are understanding that when you create a world of haves and have-nots, particularly in the West and particularly in North America, where people left their countries because that's what they left behind. They wanted to come to places where merit determined how you were going to do in life. We've got to fundamentally address these issues, and it's very complicated. In some places, taxation will address it, but that's about redistribution. And if you recall from the last presidential election in the United States, redistribution was a bad word. The idea that you would take from the rich and give to the poor is a bad word. It is sort of what our tax system does. So we have to have a real and open discussion about income and wealth inequality and how to fix it. But it starts with understanding that it's actually a thing. That the amount of work you put into something, the amount of education you have, doesn't necessarily determine whether you'll get a fair share of the pie. But in the discourse now, we can't even agree on what fair means. So it's some time before we can actually say something's broken. How do we fix it? This problem will solve itself. The demographic problem will solve itself. The issue is not how Democrats deal with it. It's going to be how Republicans deal with it, because the Republicans have taken advantage of the idea that they've got a built-in constituency which has served them very, very well for a lot of years. Now, all of a sudden, that constituency is dying off. It is not as influential as it was. So what do Republicans do about that? Traditionally, Republicans have been seen as a party that handles fiscal issues better, and there's probably some longing for that. So if they could reinvent themselves into fiscal conservatives and social liberals, that might work. If you look in the United States in the campaign now, Gary Johnson, a third-party candidate, is running at about 10% in the polls on a fiscally conservative, socially liberal message. It's kind of remarkable to get 10% of the electorate saying that they might vote for him. So this is sort of the kind of thing that Republicans have to focus on, but they don't show any intention or likelihood of actually doing that. They seem to think that's what they should do, but they don't have a roadmap for it. Hillary Clinton has an affinity for NAFTA. Her husband signed it into law. It wasn't his deal. It was George Bush's deal, George Bush Sr.'s deal, but they couldn't get it through Congress fast enough. Bill Clinton took over. He made some changes to NAFTA, which arguably were more beneficial to Canadian workers. But Hillary Clinton doesn't want to see it dismantled. She has said, she did start off by saying that she was against the TPP deal with the Asian countries, and she was in favor of it. She changed to being against it because Bernie Sanders was against it and gaining on her in the polls. So this becomes a tough issue for her where she stands generally on trade. But I think she is likely to not mess with NAFTA and understand that in most cases Canada is an ally. Donald Trump has said that he will renegotiate NAFTA, and if he doesn't get what he wants, he'll kill it. I don't think that's practical, but it's probably a little less Canada-friendly. I've always thought that trade kind of governs the way politics goes. We talk in politics a lot about trade, but in the end, business causes trade, and trade then, makes politicians understand that trade is generally good. So I don't worry too much. I think there are, with these trade agreements, including NAFTA, it's worthwhile, everybody always looking at them and saying, hey, is there a better way to do this? Because these trade agreements are built that you can't get out of them, and you can't really renegotiate them. So Donald Trump has introduced an idea where a lot of Americans are saying, well, why can't we renegotiate them? So maybe we should all look at it and take a look at it. The problem with infrastructure is that public infrastructure isn't sexy. Everybody expects that when they turn on the light, the turn of the switch, the lights will go on. When they open the water tap, clean water comes out. We are learning in the United States that clean water doesn't always come out. We've learned during Superstorm Sandy that the lights don't always go on. So it's difficult because now this is extended to bridges and buildings and Wi-Fi and airport infrastructure and air traffic control. And we don't know how you're supposed to pay for this. It's been decades since America has had a program that says we're going to improve our built environment. The rest of the world is going and doing it. America would take $1 trillion just to get our built environment up to scratch so that we're not worried about buildings falling and bridges falling, to get our air traffic control and our Wi-Fi up to scratch. We're talking about much greater investment to actually compete with the Chinas and South Koreas of the world. That's something that requires public-private partnerships, and it's weird that in North America we're not as good at that as other countries are. Other countries have figured out that there's a way to leverage the authority and taxing power of government with the know-how of the private industry and pay for improvements. We just don't think that creatively, and I'm not sure why. We've got generations of politicians who are not thinking creatively about this. This should be the kind of thing that liberals and conservatives can embrace, Democrats and Republicans can embrace, because it creates jobs. There's money for the infrastructure. I will say one thing. We've gotten into a type of politics in both countries where we talk about these boondoggles and these bridges to nowhere and these stimulus bills that are Christmas trees. And some of that's true, but what we forget is sometimes the bridge to nowhere creates a city on the other side. Sometimes the new built environment attracts people to it. We are urbanizing. Canada's more urban than the United States is by a long shot. The United States is weirdly not urbanized for a country of its size, but it's urbanizing. And that requires a lot of building and smarts around energy efficiency and the kinds of things that cities do better than non-cities do. And we have to think about that. There's a great guy here in Toronto, Richard Florida, who is at the University of Toronto, and he thinks a lot about this. He's really an expert on urbanization and the things we have to do. If we do this in a calculated way, It's a win-win for everybody. It's more efficient to live in cities. It'll upgrade our infrastructure. We'll grow our food here. We'll have cleaner water. We'll have better transmission of electricity. But we don't have a national plan that sort of supports that. And that's what we have to think about. By the way, the absence of a national plan is why Toronto's one big traffic jam. We don't even have a municipal plan for this sort of thing. So we do have to start to think, I miss some of the old politicians to whom urban planning was important. Now we just sort of build and we don't think about it that way. If we were to think about it that way, why did it take so many decades to get a train from Pearson Airport to downtown? These are the things we need to think about.